After about a decade, I think it's finally time to paint my second ever tank. My custom Warhammer Inquisition army has been lacking some tanky units for a while now. The solo auxiliary Basilisk from Horus Heracy seemed to fit in reasonably well with the army already, particularly since it had trim, giving it more of an elite feel, though I became less a fan of the trim later on for reasons you'll see. I started assembling the tank as normal, but keeping smaller parts that would attach to the main armor plates as separate, and I'll explain why in just a second. As I do all this though, I do want to take just a quick moment to thank you all so much for your insane support on the last video. This channel has now shot past 1,000 subscribers, and your kind words in the comments really did mean a heck of a lot to me. So yeah, just thanks guys. Getting back on topic, I couldn't just throw everything together instantly because I wanted to try out something new. I wanted to give a sort of armor texture a go to add some cool visual interest to the armor panels and give them a sort of heavier metal feel. I was actually following a tutorial by Night Shift for this bit, which I recommend you check out if you want to do this yourself because he makes awesome videos, but I'll explain it here briefly as well. I apply some plastic cement over the area I want to texture and jab it with a stiff bristle brush, creating the basis of our rough surface. Then I use some plastic putty to push this effect further. I used Vallejos, which does seem to be a little bit thinner than what most people use, but it ended up working fine, just don't thin it as much when people tell you to. After that I leave it to dry, and then very lightly, and I do mean extremely lightly, sand it down to make the texture a bit more uniform. With that done, we could keep going. But however cool this tank looked, it wasn't looking sufficiently gothic or fancy enough to look properly inquisitorial. So I decided to try and add some relief sculpting to this armor panel here. I'd never done this before, so I wasn't really sure what I was doing, so I drew roughly what I wanted, an eagle in this case, on the panel first, and then using green stuff, a 2-part sculpting epoxy, began to block things in. I started off with the wingtip feathers, and through using an old dentist tool and a silicone sculpting tool, I gradually refined the shape back into something that actually resembled a wingtip feather. After this, I moved on to the next section and repeated the process until I had this. With this done, I could continue putting the tank together as intended, with more texturing also taking place. But it still wasn't really gothic-y enough, so I decided to give it a larger version of the reliquaries that I've put on the back of my infantry. I started by cutting out 2 little lengths from these styrene square profiles and turned the ends into these little points, which I refined slightly with sandpaper to make symmetrical. Then I needed to make the central arch. I did this with more styrene, this time cutting from a thin sheet, allowing me to cut them to roughly the right size and then bend them into the arch I was looking for and glue it together. It wasn't actually as easy as all that in practice though, because I'm lazy and I didn't measure anything, so the armor panel behind got some nasty fingerprint marks from messing around with the glue, but it was nothing some careful sanding couldn't clean up well enough. Finally, for this reliquary I wanted to put a little shelf underneath. I didn't originally intend for it to stick out too much, but as I was trimming it back I realised that it looked really cool, so I kept it protruding a little. I then added this damaged skull from the Citadel skulls box as the relic, but something wasn't looking quite right. I think there was maybe a little bit too much space, so I added some tiny candles, which I made by wrapping a tiny amount of green stuff around a short length of wire, squeezing them into roughly a candle-like shape, but you know, that's pretty vague when it's a dribbly candle, and then pulling some excess over the edge to create a little bit of that candle dribble. This fitted the gothic, fancy, but still reasonably utilitarian aesthetic I'm trying to get for this army. Then the construction could continue as normal, until I decided to add some more little reliquaries. These were a lot simpler though, since they are actually exactly the same as the ones I have on the back of the infantry, but they fit perfectly in these little gaps. These are made with more styrene and some reliquaries from one of the Grey Knight kits. I think it's the Strike Squad, but I'm not 100% sure on that. The tank was now done, but I was going to keep it in sub-assemblies to make painting a little bit easier, particularly for the interior that this kit actually has, which is really cool, but also kind of inconvenient. Now everything's primed, it's actually time to start putting some paint on this guy, and I want to start off with the armor, because that's the sort of the main, biggest, largest colour, and it's the lowest down. But I've got all of this nice texture here, and I think if I used a brush, I'd begin to sort of forget about it, and I'll have too many like flat lines on the side, and I want to keep that kind of stipply rough effect, so I'm going to use my secret technique, the sponge. I use the sponge to lay down first a 1-to-1 mix of Eshin Grey and black, and then Eshin Grey and then eventually Mechanicus Standard Grey, covering less and less of the lower surfaces as I changed paint to create a rough gradient. However, it wasn't quite right. You could barely see the texture I'd actually put physically on the model, so I covered the surfaces with Nuln Oil. Not too thickly, otherwise it would create a sort of nasty pooling effect, which I didn't want, but this amount nicely brought out some of that texture that was already there. But in doing so, it also created a nasty shiny effect. So to dull this down, I covered the surface again with Storm Shield, which is a sort of matte-ish varnish, which nicely toned down that shine. To bring out the texture a little bit more though, I did an extremely light dry brush with Dawnstone, and this was the most extremely light dry brush I could conceivably think of doing. I'm barely even touching the surface, because I just want to lightly pick out those raised areas of the texture. I did decide at this point though that I wanted to add some battle damage on the surface, which would be in the form of impact craters from glancing blows on the tank. To do this, I drilled some holes in the front right of the model with my pin vise, after which I lengthened the craters in one direction to give the impression that these bullets were coming in at an angle or skipping off the surface when they made contact. And then I added some plastic putty into the hole, after which I pushed in the end of a paintbrush for the larger craters and a toothpick for the smaller ones to push some of that putty up out over the edges, to emulate the way that metal would warp around the impact zone. This really should have been done before painting, but I forgot about it. So I just painted over the holes with black, and then using Rhinox Hide and Trollslayer Orange, gave it a sort of rusty look, and then picked out the edges with Iron Warriors to give some shine and the idea of recently scratched metal. Then I moved on to the interior. I started by painting in the silver elements with Iron Warriors, but using dry brushing for the floor and gun to keep some of that darkness and rough look. I then painted the shells and some electrical box bits with a 1-to-1 mix of Corn Red and Cantor Blue, of course not forgetting the shell already loaded, after which I highlighted with Corn Red and Mephiston Red. Then I moved around the remaining miscellaneous bits, starting with black for the cables and the lenses, Stormhost Silver for the moving parts on the gun, and Balthazar Gold for some more random electrical-y bits we've got in here. Finally, I used these random reds, greens and blues to paint in the buttons and lenses. For this sort of glowy lens type thing, I painted in increasing brightnesses of blue towards the centre, after which I used a small dot of white, and it's come out looking a little bit like Hal from 2001, just blue instead. After this I used Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade to dirty up the floor. All that was left to do now was the trim, but since I do the same technique on the exterior, I'll explain that in a second. I then cleaned up the contact points and glued together the interior. It didn't go together all that well, so I used some liquid green stuff to fill in the gaps where I could, but it still wasn't really that great. But now I could begin painting the trim, which I base coated with a 2-to-1 mix of Rhinox Hide and Balthazar Gold. This took a really very long time. There's a ridiculous amount of trim on this model. I'm never painting any trim again in my entire life. But this was just the first of 4 stages of trim painting. Oh no. I did give myself a break from the trim though, painting in the miscellaneous functional looking areas with the same burgundy mix I used on the interior, highlighted in the same way. I then added a red stripe to each side of the tank, with another on the cabin, and fully painted in the armour plate around the base of the gun too. This was done with a 50-50 mix of Corn Red and black, layered up unevenly with Corn Red to emulate that textured sponging effect that we had on the rest of the armour, and finally highlighting with Mephiston Red. After which I painted in the vents and some of the other exposed metal areas with Iron Warriors, dry brushing the tracks for the same reasons that we dry brushed the floor. Next I covered the upper 50% of the trim with Balthazar Gold, and then covered it all in a layer of Agrax Earthshade. This took the shine off the lower areas a little bit, and also just dulled the whole thing down, because I didn't want this model to be too bright. Finally, I added a very small layer just to the corners and brightest areas of the model, with a 1-to-1 mix of Balthazar Gold and Retributor armour. At this point I added on most of the rest of the sub-assemblies with superglue, since it sticks to paint. This would mean that there'd be a little bit more of a seam between the pieces than if we'd shade back the contact points and used plastic glue, but that's not really that important for these bits, they're pretty separate anyway. The cannons were looking a little bit flat though, so I decided to dry brush on some lead belcher to the upper facing surfaces to give them more three-dimensionality. And with that we were getting towards the end stages, so I began to hop around a bit here. I finally do that highlight with Dawnstone over the armour that I was talking about back at the beginning of this section. I paint in the lenses much like I did on the inside, and added some thinned flash kits yellow to the area lit by the spotlight. I did also come back with pure Retributor armour here just to give it the sort of brightest shine of all the metal areas. Then I painted in the bone, candles and purity seals. I did these all in roughly the same way, layering up with Gothel Brown, Baneblade Brown, and Screaming Skull, covering less area each time, though I did differentiate the candles slightly, and I used more gassed bone instead of Screaming Skull, because the candles and skull were actually right next to each other, and you'd notice a bit more clearly that they were painted exactly the same. To paint the wax on the purity seals, I used Corn Red, and then layered up slightly more with Mephiston Red in much the same way that I painted the parchment, and then used Black Templar to write on the text, since it flows a little bit more nicely off the brush than normal black paint does. Then I decided to paint on some freehand numbers with Ulthothan Grey, adding some text from beneath and an Inquisition symbol on the front. All that was left now to do was the weathering, which I did by painting a very thin layer of Rhinox hide and Gothel Brown over the tracks to emulate dirt build up in the recesses, and I also added this to the lower parts of the armour panels covering the track, since there's probably a reasonable amount of spray up from mud and boggy water or whatever this tank is going through. Finally, I used the smoke pigment from AK Interactive to blacken the cannon tips, exhausts, and the vents. And with that done, the tank is finished. Well, I've tried out a lot of new things in this video, and I think they've worked out pretty great. So I really do encourage you guys to go and experiment with things like armor texture that I really don't see a whole lot in the miniature painting world. Thanks for watching till the end, and once again, thanks so much for getting this channel well past the 1,000 subscriber milestone. And with that, I'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.